Normandy, June 1944. For the crew of a German Tiger I, the battlefield was often a place of predatory calm, a landscape where they reigned as undisputed lords of the steel horizon. They sat encased behind 4 inches of Krupp-forged steel, wielding an 88-millimeter gun that had turned the vast Eastern Front into a charred graveyard of Soviet armor. To these men, the sudden appearance of an American Sherman was usually a moment of relief, a Ronson or a Tommy cooker that they expected to burst into a catastrophic pillar of flame at the first touch of a German shell. But suddenly, the commander's breathing hitches. In a distant column of standard Shermans, he spots a jagged silhouette that defies his recognition. The barrel is far too long. It overhangs the hull with a predatory reach. The muzzle brake is bulbous, alien, and menacing. Before he can even process the threat or shout a ranging order to his gunner, a violent, white-hot flash erupts from the distant tree line, miles beyond what he considered the danger zone. The Tiger's front glacis, armor thought to be invincible by the laws of ballistics, is punched through as if it were parchment. The interior of the tank becomes a whirlwind of sparks and lethal energy. This was no ordinary Sherman. This was the Firefly. Why did the most elite tank crews of the Third Reich fear this British hybrid more than any heavy American tank or high-altitude bomber? Why did German doctrine shift from aggressive arrogance to absolute shivering panic the moment a long barrel appeared on the horizon? To understand the specific cold-blooded panic the Firefly inspired in the German Panzerwaffe, one must first understand the state of armored warfare in the summer of 1944. The German tank crews who descended upon Normandy were not the raw, untested recruits of 1939. They were the hardened, cynical survivors of the Russian steppe. They arrived in France carrying a sense of technical invincibility that was not mere propaganda, it was well earned. Their primary weapons, the Tiger I and the Panther, represented the absolute pinnacle of mid-war German engineering. For the German commander, the battlefield was reduced to a simple, lethal equation of range and armor. The Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 could reliably destroy an Allied tank from over 2 kilometers away, while the standard Allied 75mm guns were effectively useless against the Tiger's front plate at almost any distance. This disparity created a localized phenomenon known as Tiger phobia among the Allies, but for the Germans, it birthed a dangerous, almost intoxicating sense of security. They viewed the mass-produced American and British Sherman tanks not as combatants, but as mobile targets, tall, relatively thin-skinned machines that had prioritized logistics over battlefield survival. They mockingly called them Tommy cookers because they expected them to ignite like torches upon impact. This confidence was rooted in the armor gap. German crews were trained to believe that at a range of 1,000 meters, they were essentially immune to any Allied return fire. This psychological safety allowed them to adopt aggressive, highly exposed firing positions on ridgelines that would have been suicidal on the Eastern Front. They would sit in the open, calmly picking off Allied vehicles one by one with the detached air of a sportsman, confident that the short-barreled Shermans could do nothing but spark harmlessly against their heavy mantlets. However, the British Army had recognized this imbalance long before the first landing craft hit the sand. They knew that if the invasion was to succeed, they needed a tank killer that could go toe-to-toe with the German heavyweights in the hedgerows. The solution was the Ordnance QF 17-pounder. This was not a standard tank gun. It was a high-velocity anti-tank monster, a beast originally intended to be towed by heavy trucks. The technical challenge of the Firefly was seemingly impossible. How do you fit a gun this large and powerful into the turret of a Sherman, a tank never designed to handle such immense recoil and weight? The result was a masterpiece of desperate, late-war improvisation. To make the gun fit, British engineers had to strip the turret of its internal radio, move the loader to the opposite side, and even cut a jagged hole in the back of the turret, covered by an armored box, to allow for the gun's massive recoil stroke. When German intelligence officers first saw grainy, long-distance photos of the tank, they dismissed it as a comical extension, a desperate British attempt to improve optics, or perhaps a ruse to hide a smaller gun. They failed to realize that this extension possessed a muzzle velocity that surpassed even their own legendary 88mm. The Firefly was not a new tank. It was a Trojan horse, a familiar shape housing a weapon that could tear the heart out of the Reich's armored pride.
To the veterans of the Panzerwaffe, the most terrifying aspect of the Firefly wasn't just its silhouette, but its specific ammunition, the APDS, or armor-piercing discarding sabot. In the German tactical school, armor was a matter of angles and thicknesses. They knew that if they sloped their armor and kept their distance, the kinetic energy of an Allied shell would inevitably dissipate or reflect. But the APDS round defied the physics of the era. By encasing a high-density tungsten core in a lightweight outer carrier, the British had created a projectile that focused all its energy into a tiny, needle-thin point, maintaining a flat trajectory and extreme velocity over immense distances. When a Firefly fired an APDS round, the German crew didn't hear the characteristic whistling whine of an incoming shell that usually gave a veteran a second to brace. They only heard the sonic crack, a sound that occurred at the exact same instant the shell impacted their armor. German technical manuals from late 1944 began to include frantic, almost panicked updates on this Tungsten Terror. They noted that the APDS round didn't just pierce the armor, it pulverized it. The impact caused spalling, a lethal shower of white-hot metal fragments from the inside of the tank's own armor plate, which would turn the interior of a Tiger into a storm of shrapnel before the shell itself even detonated. The psychological toll on German aces was perhaps the most telling evidence of the Firefly's impact. Michael Wittmann, the legendary Panzer commander who had single-handedly decimated a British column at Villers-Bocage, was the ultimate embodiment of German armored confidence. He believed his Tiger was a god on the battlefield. But even Wittmann's luck had a mechanical limit, and that limit was defined by the long barrel of the 17-pounder. During the Battle of Gaumesnil in August 1944, Wittmann's Tiger 007 was caught in a pincer. It was not a standard Allied tank that ended the career of the Reich's greatest ace. Historians conclude it was likely a Firefly of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. The news of Wittmann's death sent a shudder of realization through the Panzer divisions. If the greatest commander of the war, in the most powerful tank ever built, could be erased in a heartbeat by a modified Sherman, then the era of the Panzer was over. A Firefly had done more than just destroy a tank. It had decapitated the myth of the Panzerasse. The Germans realized that the decadent British had developed a clinical, industrial lethality that could punish the slightest ego-driven mistake with instantaneous fire and death. To a German gunner inside a Panther, the world was filtered through the circular, high-precision glass of Zeiss optics. He was trained to identify silhouettes with cold, mathematical efficiency. He knew the rounded turret and short snout of the standard Sherman, a target he could dispatch with a single, contemptuous squeeze of the trigger from over a kilometer away.
But by mid-June 1944, a new, jagged profile began to haunt these optics. It was the silhouette of the Firefly. The barrel was so long it seemed to defy the mechanical balance of the tank, and at its tip sat a bulbous double-baffle muzzle brake that resembled a clenched fist. German veterans' diaries from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend describe a phenomenon that historians now call long barrel paralysis. When a German commander identified a Firefly, his tactical priorities shifted instantly from offense to desperate preservation. They knew that while a standard Sherman had to get within 500 meters to even scratch their paint, the Firefly could reach out and shatter their hull from over a kilometer away. This range advantage turned previously aggressive German crews into reactive, hesitant defenders. They no longer trusted their armor to protect them. Instead, they began to view their massive tanks as nothing more than large, slow-moving targets for an invisible, high-velocity sniper. What truly unnerved the German crews was the sensory violence of the 17-pounder in action. Because the gun used a massive propellant charge to achieve its extreme velocity, it produced a muzzle flash that was significantly larger and more brilliant than anything the Germans had seen on a tank of that size. To a German gunner looking through his sights, a Firefly firing didn't look like a tank shot, it looked like a lightning bolt hitting the earth. This flash was so blinding that it often momentarily seared the retinas of the German gunners, leaving them flash-blinded for the critical seconds needed to adjust their aim for a return shot. In the time it took for their vision to return, the Firefly was often already chambering its second round. The Germans also noted specific forensic horror regarding the internal geometry of a Firefly strike. Because the 17-pounder shell was smaller and moved significantly faster than an 88mm, it didn't always cause the tank to explode into a fireball immediately. Instead, it would punch a clean, coin-sized hole through the armor and then ricochet wildly inside the steel tomb of the crew compartment. This kinetic chaos meant that a single Firefly hit could kill every man inside a Tiger without ever setting off the ammunition. For the recovery crews who had to tow away these silent, steel coffins, the Firefly was viewed with a superstitious dread. It was the needle that found the heart of the beast while leaving the skin intact. This dread forced the Panzerwaffe to adopt suicidal countermeasures. German gunners were ordered to fire at anything that even resembled a long barrel, even if it was a standard Sherman with a fake wooden pole attached to its gun, a common British ruse. The Germans were so obsessed with the Firefly that they would often ignore pressing infantry threats or flanking maneuvers just to ensure the long barrel was silenced. They were fighting a psychological war against a silhouette, and in their desperation to kill the Firefly, they were opening themselves up to total tactical collapse across the wider front.
The theoretical dread of the Firefly was transformed into a cold, visceral reality during the Battle of Lignievre on June 14, 1944. Here, the elite Panzer Lehr Division, a unit composed entirely of seasoned instructors and equipped with the latest Panther tanks, attempted to eject the British from the village. In the eyes of the German commanders, the Panther was the king of the medium tanks, possessing frontal armor that could shrug off almost any Allied assault. But they were about to encounter a single British sergeant, Wilfred Harris, and his Firefly. In a span of less than 10 minutes, Harris utilized the Firefly's precision and velocity to systematically dismantle an entire Panther platoon. To the German crews inside those Panthers, the experience was one of pure, unadulterated panic.
They were being hit by a weapon that didn't just penetrate their armor, but seemed to ignore it as if it were air. From the German perspective, it was as if they were fighting a ghost. They would see the flash from a barn window, and before they could even traverse their heavy turrets, the tank next to them was a funeral pyre. This was the counter-hunting failure. The Germans had been trained to hunt the long barrel, but in the claustrophobic lanes of Lingyevra, the hunter was being hunted with a clinical efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. Sergeant Harris claimed 5 Panthers with only 5 shots. To the Panzerwaffe, this was a statistical impossibility that shattered their morale. After-action reports from the Panzer Lehr veterans highlight a specific forensic detail that fueled their nightmares: the over-penetration effect. Because the 17-pounder moved at such extreme speeds, the shell would often pass completely through the side of a Panther, exiting the other side and carrying a cloud of shattered engine components and crew remains with it. This level of kinetic energy was unheard of in the Western theater. To the German tank crews, it felt as if the British had developed a superweapon that rendered the very concept of armor obsolete. They began to refer to the Firefly not as a tank, but as a mobile anti-tank gun that wore the clever disguise of a Sherman. This dread was further amplified by the introduction of the American M18 Hellcat. To the German crews, the Hellcat and the Firefly represented a lethal pincer movement of Allied ingenuity. While the Firefly provided the long-range static sniper fire, the Hellcat provided the speed of the strike. German tank commanders began to report a sense of being encircled by velocity. They were no longer fighting a slow, methodical enemy. They were fighting a force that could outrun their turret traverse and outshoot their frontal armor simultaneously. The psychological comparison was telling. While the Germans respected the speed of the American M10 and M18, they feared the Firefly's silhouette. The long barrel became a primary source of cognitive bias in the heat of battle. German gunners would frequently report seeing thousands of Fireflies, even when only a handful were present in the theater. This phantom Firefly effect caused German commanders to withdraw their heavy tanks prematurely or waste hours in cautious defensive maneuvers because they suspected a single 17-pounder was lurking in the hedgerows. The interior of a Tiger was no longer a fortress. It was a steel trap waiting to be sprung by a needle of tungsten.
As the final freezing echoes of the 1944 campaign faded into the strategic collapse of the Third Reich, the men of the Panzerwaffe were forced to reconcile with a bitter and haunting reality. The German armored forces, which had entered Normandy with a sense of technical and spiritual invincibility, had been systematically dismantled by an enemy they had fundamentally underestimated. While Allied air superiority and the sheer weight of American industry undoubtedly played their parts in the attrition, it was the Sherman Firefly that had delivered the most significant psychological blow to the German front line. It had stripped the veteran tank crews of their absolute confidence in their own invulnerability, proving that Krupp steel was no match for a high-velocity needle of tungsten. The outcome of the summer battles was not just a territorial loss for the Reich, it was the total, irreversible collapse of the heavy Panzer as the apex predator of the battlefield. From the Axis perspective, the Firefly represented a catastrophic failure of intelligence and a lethal misunderstanding of their enemy's capacity for rapid innovation.
The German High Command had spent years and millions of Reichsmarks developing the heavy cats, the Tiger and the Panther, under the arrogant and stagnant assumption that the Allies would never be able to mount a gun capable of challenging their thickest frontal armor. They viewed the Sherman as a decadent design of a nation they believed lacked a true military soul. But the Firefly proved that the British possessed a brand of industrial ingenuity they had never predicted. By mating a mass-produced chassis with a high-velocity God-Slayer gun, the Allies had bypassed the German engineering advantage entirely. It was the ultimate proof that in a total war, the ability to adapt existing tools is far more lethal than the pursuit of over-engineered perfection. The long-term impact on German morale and tactical deployment was profound and paralyzing. In the final months of the conflict, German armored doctrine underwent a forced and frantic shift from the aggressive blitzkrieg maneuvers of 1940 to a reactive, defensive posture bordering on guerrilla warfare. The pervasive fear of the long barrel forced German crews to spend hours meticulously camouflaged in the tree line, moving only under the cover of absolute darkness to avoid the reach of the 17-pounder. They had effectively become a guerrilla armor force, terrified that the moment they revealed their position, a Firefly would find them from a range they couldn't even counter. This tactical paralysis meant that the Germans could no longer launch the large-scale coordinated counterattacks necessary to turn the tide. The Firefly hadn't just killed German tanks, it had killed the German will to maneuver. In post-war interrogations, a recurring theme among captured Panzer commanders was a grudging, haunted respect for the British hybrid. They admitted that while the American 76mm guns were a persistent threat, it was the Firefly that forced them to reconsider every single engagement, no matter how favorable the odds appeared on paper. The Firefly had unbalanced the traditional tank duel, turning the hunt into a game where the German was always at a disadvantage. It was the ultimate proof that in a total war, the ability to adapt existing tools is far more lethal than the pursuit of over-engineered perfection. The legacy of the Firefly remains a testament to the power of adaptation over pure engineering. It was a stopgap measure that became a legend, a desperate improvisation that ended the era of German armored dominance once and for all. To the men who sat inside the Tigers and Panthers, the Firefly was the sound of the future, a high-velocity, supersonic crack that announced the end of their 1,000-year Reich. They started the war believing they were the hunters, the undisputed kings of the steel landscape. They ended it huddled in the shadows, frantically scanning every hedgerow for a silhouette they had learned too late to fear. The myth of the invincible Panzer had been pierced, and what remained was only the fire. For the Axis soldier, it wasn't just the guns, planes, or tanks that were terrifying. It was the Allied ingenuity they could never predict.